We are lighting the candle, a world that works. I'm Bill Correll here, and I'm with my dear friend Jan Jeremias. And so I think today what we're just going to do is leap off the cliff of linguistics and empowering language and see what we can pull from, whatever seems to be going on in the world. I'm quite interested at the moment in how we are behaving as an East Coast to the threats of hurricanes and tornadoes and that sort of thing. So there's a weather component to this weekend. Plus, I think out of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we got rain every day. And today is pretty much the only day. Originally, we were supposed to have rain all this week too, every day, but it looks like it's going to be clear today and maybe again tomorrow. And the reason I bring this up is sometimes our lives look like that. Like we're staring into a really bad weather forecast, and sometimes that can bring a lot of future expectations into the now. And so when that happens, Jan, what do we do?
Gosh, I was just, was just on a call earlier about, it was about leadership and whatnot, and we were chatting about, and I think that, for me, I was speaking to, gratitude and appreciation. I think when life seems very dark or dim or stormy is a good way if you want to use your metaphor of like extreme storms this weekend. Um, that's what I try to practice is, somebody asked me, and I've been going through kind of a stormy time, and somebody asked me yesterday, how you doing? And I said, well, I'm just grateful for, like, all the things I have to be grateful for. And just go into it from that. I just think it keeps me positive. It makes me focus a little bit less on what I feel is not going right versus versus, because as human beings, that's what we do. We might have 100 things that are going really well in our life, and one negative thing will happen, and that's where our attention goes. Like, and all of a sudden everything is bad in our life. Like we have one thing that's, not working. We have one client that says no, or we get one email which is negative, or one text, and then all of a sudden, that's our whole entire world is that one thing. So trying to keep it a little bit broader and put a little bit in perspective, which I find, gratitude is one of the ways that I do or I utilize to do that.
Yeah. I think gratitude can be a really good anchor and allow you to come back to the present in situations where you notice your mind has just really gone like a little bit crazy. But the other thing, staying with the weather metaphor for a moment, what I've noticed, and I follow the weather every single day, more often than not, just so I can make fun of it, because it almost never is what's being predicted. And I have this thing that I do with my wife whenever we make plans to go somewhere, and it says that it's going to be sunshiny and it's an outdoor deal that we're going to be doing. I tell her guaranteed it's going to rain. And then I sort of keep track of my accuracy in debunking the myth that's coming from the weather guys, right? And the other thing that I just want to just presence is that we hear weather forecasts as if they are a good predictor of the future and the truth, when you and I both know they're pretty much not. So I like the idea of having an anchor such as gratitude. And when you start to notice that your mind is taking you places that you should not let you go, to borrow James Taylor's words, it's really very comforting to have a moment and say, now, wait a minute. Um, and I don't know if it was Twain or Will Rogers who said, I've experienced many a terrible thing in my life, some of which actually happened.
And I think it
So,
was Mark Twain.
yeah. But those two guys, I think, came from similar places, but I think one had a little more education than the other, possibly. But they were both brilliant men in terms of saying, what's so. So when you come right back down to it, thinking in terms of the whole weather metaphor, When there's a prediction of good weather or a bad weather, you can plan appropriately, but why not always have like a plan B and a plan C just in case something else happens? Because I don't know, in my experience, life's pretty good at giving you all the things you didn't plan for. So plan for other things that will at least allow you to come back and be grateful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the idea of, of planning, or sometimes really, getting in touch with how you're feeling and planning from there. I love having a plan. And I use the example of, when my dad passed, after my dad passed, that first Father's Day, I was really nervous. I was like, how am I going to be? Am I going to be sad? Am I going to like, what's going to happen? And obviously, what was in my head and in my heart was, because I was thinking about it a lot. Let's say as the days kind of came up to Father's Day, I was like, oh my gosh, Father's Day is going to come, like in this almost panic kind of mode. Like, and I wasn't quite sure. And then I thought to myself, I'm going to get up and just see how I feel on that day. Like, I don't want to make plans. I had like a tentative kind of plan in my head, but I didn't attach to that plan. I was very much like, let me just get up and see how I feel.
Right.
And so I got up that day and I said, well, I really don't want to be home. Like, I just didn't want to be in the house alone. Like, I just think I was afraid it was going to be too depressing and sad. So I remember going out and doing everything that he would have wanted to do, like, exploring and going new places and looking at new things and all this other stuff. And it was like he was there with me doing all those things. So it was a really great way for me to keep him close, but not in a sad way. It was much more in a like he was there, like, oh, I'm doing this with dad. Like, he's not physically here, but whatever you want to say, energetically, emotionally. So sometimes a plan is great. But I think what we need to do, as hard as it is, and sometimes we can't, is be willing to actually ask ourselves those kind of like, and was working with a client last week and I said this to her, like, how do you feel and what do you need right now to make you feel better? Like, what would make you like, do you need to get outside in nature? Do you need to be sitting quiet for a few moments? Do you need to put on good music and dance? Do you need to cook, like do something sort of creative? Like,
Yeah.
what is it you need right now? And so I think that that's been my sort of like what I've been going to a lot lately.
Yeah.
Is just like, okay, I'm anxious. What do I need right now that's going to help calm me down, or that's going to help me be less anxious? Or, I'm happy now. Who can I share that with?
Yeah.
You know, how can I spread that a little bit?
So, as you were describing what you did, just kind of celebrate Father's Day by going out and being with your father, driving around. Did you pretend like you were lost a little bit? I mean,
I did. I did. I did. I did. And I also ended up doing things like, I remember I sat there and I printed out a map. I don't usually, I love maps, but I don't own many maps anymore.
right.
And so I was like, oh, let me print out a map of where I am because my father loved maps. So it was, but yeah, funny that you say that. But I did pretend I was lost. But it was really such a beautiful day. And I think it taught me a lot about, let's say, that whole, because I tend to be a planner
Right.
and I tend to, like a plan. I have to do lists, that's just my kind of, I would say my analytical brain of, systems and methods and things like that. But then realizing sometimes you have to like throw your hands up and say, okay, there is no plan.
Well, see, one of the things that I learned in business a long time ago, because I really stopped going to university and wound up going and working with my hands as a laborer in a manufacturing plant here in Willimantic. And so I had, roughly 2.5 years of college under my belt in terms of college credits and classes and all the rest of that. I actually had more than that because I went to University of Connecticut for a year, where what I really got out of that was how to smoke pot, drink beer, and date women. Okay, and play golf. Okay, so those I wasn't too terrible, but I didn't know it at the time. I had to come back to Connecticut in order to meet my wife, so I could have the life I have now. All of it was perfect, just the way that it happened, even though it was very traumatic. So I think where I'm going with this whole notion of being in a position that I would not have said that I was comfortable in a lot of the times, I just kept pushing ahead, and so I went for jobs that had more responsibility. Did I think I could do it? No, I knew I could do it, under the correct circumstances. So my whole life was about getting the circumstances lined up so that I was successful in whatever this new thing where I jumped into the deep end without knowing how to swim over and over and over again. But what I did do that was really, really smart, it's almost like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where you've got to phone a friend, and that you're public about what you want to accomplish in your life, so that it's not really usual for people like you and me, Jan, to have an off day and for it to last for an indeterminate period of time. So having the first step in the plan to fall to, and while you're in that first step, doing two things: reading the room and then reading yourself as to whether or not it's the right time and the place for what you were planning to do, or is this a good place to maybe invent something new and different. And I can say that that's what I was doing now, but at the time I think I called it figuring it out. You know what I mean? So just continuously not quitting and not giving up, and if people weren't going the direction, rather than using force, I get into a conversation like, where do we want to go today? What's going to work? Okay. I use that what's going to work an awful lot. And there were times when I didn't have that available to me. It was like not remembering to be grateful, because I didn't have that going for me back in those days at all. Uh, I just, knew that I was over my head and I didn't know what to do next. And sometimes it occurred to me to ask people for help.
No, I
Those
love
turned out to
I,
be okay.
I love that idea of asking people for help. I think that we have a very poor, um I want to say, perception or idea of what of help. I think that people look at it as weak. It creates a lot of fear and anxiety for people because they have to admit that they couldn't do something.
Right.
And sometimes it's the biggest blessing of all is, this whole idea you can give to someone that it's not considered weak. It's actually considered being very strong to me, being able to ask for help,
Right.
because there is this feeling of like, well, just because I need help doesn't mean, it doesn't define me. It doesn't belittle me and my expertise. It just means that whatever I'm doing, I don't know that yet. And, and I think that and it's something that you can definitely learn. Like that to me can be a learned sort of trait, because, I always say that, you know, growing up or working as an adult within, in the age that I was working in, let's say, much more kind of cosmopolitan corporate type settings where, you know, women in the workforce got to be very big deal and everything. You didn't want to ask for help. You were taught to be independent. You were afraid that men were going to come back and say, that you were, think you were less because you were a woman in this role versus a man in the role in that job. And so you would have done anything and to probably hide the fact that you didn't know something.
Right. Right. It was not considered powerful, to, especially with subordinates who were half your age, and in some cases like I was, until I got to that point where I really absolutely knew that they were milking the cow. My job was to make them the best damn milkers that they could, and then get the hell out of their way. Make, when that dawned on me, what can I do to make you famous? I would ask people that. Okay, what's missing for you to be known around here as the absolute best planner we've ever had, the absolute best purchasing agent, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a different conversation than telling people, I don't like what you're doing.
Right, exactly. No, that is a very, very good point. That's a very different conversation.
Yeah.
It's a very different conversation to sit there and just, and to that point, it's, and the whole, like, whether it be happiness, like what can I do to make this, this place or this, whether it be in a job or this environment, a more joyful place for you to be.
Right.
And I think that to that effect is, if we could shift people's focus to working toward their strengths, like, one is recognizing what they're good at, and somehow, even if changing it so that becomes more dominant, I think people will end up feeling a lot more content and being able to weather the storm a lot easier. Not to say that, that between that and asking for help, right? So then, this is my strength. I do this really well. This is something that I have a challenge with. And can I find someone in my life or outside my life where that's something that they love to do? And
Yeah.
then not take advantage of in a negative way, but take advantage of the fact that this is something they truly enjoy, love, or whatever.
Yep.
I say that, together my parents made this complete individual, because they each, had their own strengths, and they kind of made one complete functioning person between them,
Yes.
kind of thing. And so that's that's why we're all here, right? Because each one of us is different. Otherwise, we would all be, we would all become like, get born, and we would all be able to do exactly the same thing.
We get exactly the same thing everywhere. Things would
Exactly.
never get better, would never get worse. They would just stay kind of boring and dull.
And boring, dull, and nothing would ever change. There's no room. That's where all communication and collaboration, that's where growth happens, or that's where things, that's where inventions get made. It's not when everybody has the same traits and is trying to contribute to a project.
Yeah. I especially love that what we're accessing here is the kind of the road to workability. And we start off with, we've got a weather forecast. It's not true and it's not wrong, but it's not here yet. It's a discussion of what may or may not happen in the future. And in, what ways does that inform our present? So, again, when we're thinking about it taking us out of our game, or being concerned about big plans that you have, like for, I don't know, a wedding or graduation, and it's all supposed to be outside, and you haven't ordered a tent in case that it rains or whatever. And at the same time, that's tomorrow still. There may still be time to put something else in place, but like most people have an immediate present where there's just a lot of things they got to work on today already. And so what it can do is it can rob you of your joy and your experience of a wonderful present, while you're so concerned about what may go wrong tomorrow. And in many cases, either it does or it doesn't. But in the end of the day, you're still here. You've survived all those other things that worked and didn't work up to this point. I mean, what's going to be different about that?
Well, it's interesting because I love your wedding, and now, your wedding, because I was listening to a podcast not too long ago when she was talking about that, weddings, and, about that whole idea of planning and also worrying about things like that basically you have no control over, like the weather. And so she sat there and she was like, realizing, okay, especially if you've done everything you can do. So
Yeah.
especially if you've actually said, okay, well, I do have a tent in case it rains, or I have paid for everything, and I have contracts for everything, kind of thing. And I was talking to a friend whose granddaughter was getting married, and there was a lot going on. The wedding looked spectacular, and supposedly everything went off like without a glitch. But I remember sitting there and saying to her, "What's the most important thing?" And that is that they're married in the end. No matter what happens, is the fact that they love each other and they're married. I said, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of shifting people's focus a little bit. Well, if I don't know, something happens and it doesn't go exactly as planned, what's the most important thing is that, whatever, sometimes I think you need to get a little, you do need a little perspective of like, because we tend to get very focused on the minutiae of
Yep.
something, like, the fact that we want something to happen exactly like this. And then all of a sudden, when that doesn't happen, we become gravely disappointed, or we can't, you know, we just can't get out of our own way. But if we can shift that a little bit and say, okay, well, bottom line is no matter what, they're still going to be married, and hopefully, and everybody they wanted there was there. And if they didn't want anybody there, no one was there. Whatever. But shifting that away a little bit.
Well, it's an interesting thing. What you reminded me of is the experience that we had when I performed a Navajo wedding on tribal reservation. For my son-in-law's family put the whole thing together in terms of the location. They built a shade hut outside. It was basically an open end facing east, towards the sunrise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those things that are all part of the Navajo, uh, uh, you know, um, the traditions. And there were many things that we found out. One is that the bride's family is responsible for all the food for the wedding, and what that looked like was, I mean, I paid for everything. We bought a couple of sheep, and we had all of this stuff they used to make fry bread and just lots of other things like that. And it was also a Navajo tradition, for the bride to be to slaughter the first sheep. And so my daughter did that. She, with love in her heart and tears in her eyes and bawling like a baby. I wasn't there to see it, but she told me all about it afterwards. And all the Navajo in-laws that were there were so impressed with her and her ability to just do what it takes for her family, to provide for her family. And so that happened. And then we get to the point where we it's time for her wedding ceremony, and they call me up and let me know about an hour and a half before we're supposed to be there. I need to get there a half hour early because I'm going to be performing the wedding ceremony. And I was like, okay, I wonder what's involved with that. So we drove the 45 minutes to get there, and they took about 20 minutes, kind of explaining the ritual. And there was some stuff with bee pollen and with this significant woven basket, that we had to, do some things. And it was 115 degrees out and over 120 people in this shade hut. But along one wall were about 15 or 20 of these tribal elders, all women. And so we get into the ritual that they had mentioned that we needed to do. I'm on my knees in front of Heidi and Tyson. Tyson's to my right and Heidi's to my left. They're both dressed up in traditional, Navajo Indian wedding garb. My daughter's wearing a rug dress, a carpet dress that had been probably made in the night around 1900. She had, these traditional moccasins that hadn't been worn in a wedding since Tyson's grandmother was married, whatever year that was, in 1935 or 1940. And so it went, and there I am in front of them, and all of a sudden, we're doing what we were told to do in the order and everything, and start hearing all this murmuring and all the elderly tribal leaders over against the wall. You can imagine the din, of all of them. Heidi leans into me. She says, "Dad, I think we're doing it wrong." I look back and I said, "Look, none of us have been here before, but whatever happens, I'm sure when we're done, you're going to be married. So let's get over it." So, when all was said and done, we got, a standing ovation, because not only were they married, but they got through the first turmoil of their life where something or someone from the outside was trying to upset them. And they were still powerful in the moment, and they got through it. And turned out that all the murmuring was to do that, was to give them that experience of what it's going to be like when they hear other people criticizing or angry, relatives, or what's going on in the world outside, or politics, or what. None of that has anything to do with your marriage. So focus on that first.
Focus
That
on that.
was so cool. Yeah.
That is extremely cool. And what a great lesson, for them. And I think any experience that we have where we get any sort of realization or light bulb moment, because they're all around us if we choose to see them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned before that, I remember when I first started teaching yoga, I would plan out like all my classes, like literally the exact sequence I was going to teach and what I was going to teach in what order. And yes, I was a new teacher, so I tended to do that. But then I remember going one day to teach, and everybody who walked in on that day, because I was teaching in person at the time, could not have done one thing that I was had on my list. And all of a sudden, I remember standing there, or sitting there in front of in the room with all these people, thinking to myself, like, oh my God, like those few seconds of like panic. I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do?
Yeah.
And then realizing that I basically had to use my intuition and I had to wing it, like not in a bad way, but I had to like read the room, ask people what they needed, um, if anything physically was bothering them that day, or how people felt lethargic if I couldn't read it, or energized or whatever, and having to teach to that. And I remember that was when I learned that no matter how much you plan, you never know who's walking in front of you and who's going to walk into the room. It was
Yeah.
like, okay, I can plan this all I want, but the bottom line is I have to like communicate with other people to figure out what they need at the day, because this isn't about me. Like
Right.
that's where also it wasn't about me. It became much more about them and what their needs were, which is what yoga is. And as a teacher, that's what I'm there to guide them toward, is like, to get them to a place where they feel more at ease. And, you know, and yes, through the years, I've gained a lot of intuition. So usually what I need is what my students need. It just happens to be like that. But in the beginning, I remember being very daunted, but then leaving and thinking to myself that was the biggest gift I could have been given, because it was such a growth opportunity for me in my teaching and becoming a better teacher and a better whatever guide or whatever, however you want to call it. Because otherwise I would have been, teaching to that, 8 poses on my printed out sheet for the next, how many years.
Yeah.
you know?
I think that's an excellent way of bringing up another metaphor, in that life is dancing. Life is not doing what you do and forcing your way through and just bowling it off. Life is about elegantly and gracefully dancing with what happens, to the extent that you possibly can. But in all of that, it's so important. Calmness and joy and all of the other intentions that you have that would supersede the reactionary type stuff of being afraid or losing your mind in the moment, panicking, all that. Those are not authentic reactions. Those are the reactions of somebody who's very young and unprepared to be in the circumstances that you're in. But why is that we experience those things all the time? Well, see, there it is. That's what life's all about, is how do you dance in the face of all of these, pretty human responses that you have to situations that you're neither used to, nor do you feel like you're prepared for. So that's kind of, the dancing metaphor for me is one that works really well.
I love that, Bill, because when you said that, I'm like dancing in the rain. Like
Yeah.
that whole idea of can you dance in the rain? And some of it is that very childlike kind of mentality, like a playfulness to it. I lived in the city. I lived in Manhattan for many, many years. And I made my two favorite rain stories, or two kids stories of like not kids I knew. And one day I see this guy in a business suit, walking you know, his little girl or little boy. It was like in the morning. So he was going on his way to work. So he must have been dropping him off at school. They were like 3 or 4. So they weren't necessarily school aged yet. And I remember, I think it was a little girl, and every puddle they walked by, she had to stamp her feet in,
Yep.
like she had to go through the puddle. And him trying to be patient, saying, honey, we really don't have time to dance in every puddle, kind of thing. But that image, as you were talking about, like that whole thing of dancing and everything, that's what came to me is this: can we be open to like stepping in the puddles, like getting your feet wet?
Yeah.
And the other image was this little boy who, from Sesame Street days. So there he is. He's walking down the street and he's lifting up all the garbage can covers. And the father saying to him, I'm telling you, honey, Oscar doesn't live on this block. It was so hysterical as I watched this guy in a business suit and the little boy like picking up every garbage can cover, and him needing to get to work and trying to be so sweet and patient, but like sitting there going like, Oscar doesn't live on this block. Like he just doesn't, it was so funny.
Yeah.
That whole idea of like almost being kid like. When you're a kid, that ability to explore and be curious and learning is like everything is a learning experience. Everything.
Yeah.
The fact that the door opens like that is a learning experience.
If I may,
Yeah.
I'll just hang on to that. The whole notion of dancing is both a demonstration of being powerful in this moment, being pretty sure that you can't be, or are not powerful. So what do? You dance. You figure out where's it going. How do I, instead of resisting and all that. And so you're also inviting and invoking a future that's very uncertain. When you're in a situation that calls for fight or flight, and you choose to dance, uh, it's kind of an interesting thing that now, okay, I got through this. Now what else is coming here? And then at some point you start to figure out that this isn't an unusual situation. This is just how life shows up. So the notion of being a kid and stomping in every possible puddle that you can see, and then being an adult that kind of encourages that behavior, but can you do it more quickly, please? What,
Right, exactly.
what I like to call riding the horse the direction that it's going,
Right, exactly, exactly. And I remember him saying, well, maybe Oscar lives on the next block,
right.
kind of thing, to get there, get his little girl to go there kind of thing. But not wanting to say, like curb her idea, because it was really cute, the fact that, if you think about it, I mean, Oscar lived in a garbage can on Sesame Street. So it made sense that Oscar should live on a Manhattan Upper East Side city block, somewhere in the garbage can. It's
Or
logical.
could be a distant cousin.
Right, exactly, exactly. But as you were saying, I have I have a a phrase that I have that I leave out all the time. And this whole idea of stillness and, can we get to a place of within ourselves that's, somewhat like you might want to say is quiet, stillness, just a moment of a breath, a pause. And I have, stillness is dancing with the divine. It's the divine aspect of ourselves. It's the part of ourselves that's kind of spacious, that's not attached, that doesn't get phased, that um so it says stillness is dancing with the divine. So since we're on the mode of dancing, um and there's something, freeing, explorative. And when we're kids, we do. If you think about like just spinning and getting dizzy and just thinking that it's hysterical, when you would like just spin around in circles and then fall down on the grass and you thought it was so funny.
Yeah.
And you would just belly laugh like the fact that you had fallen down on purpose, like um, but there is that whole element of dancing because it's very freeing, very expressive, and very yeah, freeing, expressive. It's um in general you can work out some of that probably, uncomfortableness, awkwardness. Maybe we should encourage dancing at work,
Yeah.
like or something, or dancing more at home anyway. Dance with your kids, see what happens,
Or just imagine dancing. You
or just
know,
imagine dancing, right?
Another way to access that is if you'll engage me for a moment, I'll ask you a question. Jan, what do you love about your life?
Oh, what do I love about my life? I love the people that are in my life, like the people the community of people that I've built around me. Um, I love my pets. Um, I love where I live and the fact that, it's beautiful and I get to look out at this unbelievable scene every morning. What else?
What do you love most about your life?
Oh, what do I love most about my life? Me.
And what do you love most about you?
Um, I think I love I love my kindness and my inquisitive kind of curiosity that I've worked really hard now to cultivate, like that non-judgmental curiosity about people, life, experiences.
Hmm. Interesting that when you start to describe what you love about you, it's about your interaction with other people.
Well, that interaction also includes the interaction that I have with myself. So it's that, that I've become a lot less judgmental about myself
Yep.
and a lot more like inquisitive and curious about like the things that, and maybe some of those are negative things, what I would label as negative. So, it might be traits I don't like or behaviors that I have. Is to sit there and all of a sudden get that kind of inquisitive kind of curiosity about it as to like, what is this really about or where does it come from? Um, y- so I love that about my nature now is that, the whole idea, because I think in that there's much more room for compassion and love and empathy versus, the focusing on the differences between people as opposed to the common things we all share.
Sure. And can you say some more about how you show yourself that you love you?
Oh gosh. Um, well, I think I take care of myself. Like that's one of the ways I kind of express that love for myself. I've gotten much. I want to say better because I still think I drive myself pretty hard. Like I'm tend to be pretty disciplined, so I tend to be like I've got to accomplish this, I've got to accomplish that. But I think I also, and a good word is honor. I think I honor the fact of like when I need rest and like restoration.
Yes.
Like if I have a really hard week, I think that, a weekend might come, or, well, I say week because sometimes I'm working weekends. So that week, that might be a day during the week, not necessarily a weekend day, but where I'll sit there and say, okay, today's my day. Like when sometimes it gets to the point where I really can't do anything today. Like I really can't. I need to read. I need to watch a movie. I need to spend some time, like quite a good chunk of time outside where I'm actually experienced. So that whole idea of, you know, really appreciating, like realizing when I'm tired and I need to rest and restore. Like I
Yeah.
think I show myself that much more easily now that I'm getting older than I used to. I have a really close friend who naps every day. Every day she takes a nap and has for years. Not a long nap, but every day she takes like a 20-minute nap. And if she doesn't sleep, she just lies down for 20 minutes or sits up and just relaxes with her eyes closed for 20 minutes,
Right.
and has for like 20 or 30 years. And, the whole idea of doing things like that. So I hope that answered your question.
Oh, it gave me more questions. I'm very curious.
Of course it did, Bill, because you're you.
I'm, I'm curious as to um, how you show compassion to yourself before you do to other people. What's access for you to do that, if you will?
I think one of the access points for me is that acknowledgement of how I'm feeling is really like when I say, how do I feel? Like that honoring of how I am in a given moment,
Right.
and not in a critical way, but in much more of, and is this all cut in stone? Am I sometimes critical? Yes, because I'm a human being and I'm not, but more than um more than I used to anyway, or definitely, moving in that realm is like, okay, how am I feeling right now? Because I think that it allows me a little bit more space to accept people for where they are at that moment. And so I have the ability to sit there and recognize that. Like, I think people become human beings
Yep.
I like, much more apparently to me. And I focus on that a lot lately, especially, I guess, today in our global kind of environment where I feel like I want to see people as human beings, like in entirety, as a conglomerate of strengths and, what some may label as weaknesses, or coming from different backgrounds and different experiences. But basically, we're all the same.
Yeah.
And so I think the first connection is I have to recognize that within myself.
And when you think about all of that, how does that make you feel?
Um, well, wise.
That
I,
that right that right there. What is that, and how does that make you feel?
yeah, I think joyful, wise. That fact that, I think some of that has come with wisdom. And I always say, people are always like, would you want to be younger? And I'm like, nah, it's okay. I'll stay my age and keep the wisdom I've gained. Thank you. I've, I've worked really hard for this wisdom.
A lot of scars, yeah, for sure.
Exactly. A lot of scars. So I think that's, yeah, I think it also gives me hope. I think I become more hopeful because I was just on I was just on that meeting, and I said that they asked me why I joined the group that I was in. And I said, partly because I think it's the only way humanity will survive. I said, if we start to look at each other as human beings,
Yep.
I said, and yeah, and that means in all aspects of life, and I think we have to get away. It's much more heartfelt, and I think that's the only way
Yeah.
as a species we'll be able to thrive. Um, because otherwise we're gonna we're gonna wipe ourselves out.
Like what I hear there is not to share a common definition of what a human being is, but to start here and genuinely get interested in what is a human being. Not what people say about it, not what people tell us it is, not a definition, but what's it feel like? How big is it? What color is it? What's it taste like? If it's not present, what's that like? If it's here and too much, what does that feel like? So that you can really kind of start to generate this new human beingness that's got some life to it. It's got some body to it. It's rich in its distinctions, as opposed to the one that's kind of like, oh, tired out, human being, oh, you again, so
Well, I listened to a podcast recently, and she was talking about labels. This whole idea of labeling, let's say, of certain type of person.
yes,
And to me, it gets people away from the labels, and it doesn't, as opposed to uniting, that idea of labeling, or the fact of like, oh, I don't know, that, the definition of a human being
right,
becomes much more compartmentalizing and differentiating versus uniting and commonality.
yes,
And so I love this idea of, basically getting curious about people and what makes you, like, almost like differentiating what makes you a human being, like, kind of thing, like, like, what makes you a human being versus, what makes, what makes me a human being. And, that's kind of like, that's a really sweet way to move through the world.
there's some very interesting aspects to that particular conversation. you know I think what I love the most about it is it kind of invokes the notion of we don't know, and let's get into a discovery conversation. And so they tell us we're human beings. What's it like for you?
Well, it's kind of right. I don't know why I have all these like stories of kids today, but that's great. So I have a little boy who lives next door to me who's 5, and he's so cute. He's really cute. And so last week I'm outside with Tonka and I'm doing some gardening, and he's, it's townhouses, so they're all connected. And so he's comes outside and he's talking to me, and Tonka's eating a bone. And I just said to him, you might want to leave him alone because he's eating now. And, as he gets older, I don't know what his response will be if somebody small comes around to take his food, or he thinks they're going to take his food. So he was good, and he let, and so he was outside, and I was gardening for quite a while, and I had to go inside. Now all the townhouses are exactly the same, they're all identical inside. So I said, I've really got to go in and do laundry. And he said, oh, can I come in and see your house? And so I said, sure, you can come in and see my house. And it's the same exact house, like layout as his house.
Yeah.
But all the questions he asked, it was kind of like, oh, you're a human being. I'm a human being. Like, share with me about being a human being. And it was kind of like he was that kind of inquisitive, very like, oh gosh, I like this, kind of thing. And, it was just so adorable. And, he's absolutely so sweet and so cute. And at one point, his mom and dad came out and said, "Is he bothering you? Is he talking too much?" But it was great. And so I think that whole idea of like, you're a human being, I'm a human being. Let me get to know you.
Yeah. And at a fundamental level, we play over that. We always start like we've got the first 3 chapters of each other, we understand, right? And our world doesn't make it easier. All this concentration on identity this and identity that, it really is a dehumanizing conversation. It's not like one where we're inviting people to ask them about why they wear their hair the way that they do, or ask them why that they have the piercings that they do. It's like, no, stay away. This is who I am. You better respect that and give me space. But I'm not interested in what you look like. That is the least interesting part of you. I am so much more interested in what happens when you open your mouth and you start stringing language together. That is, to me, so much more interesting. If I were a blind person, how would I engage you? You
Well,
know?
yeah, either that or just how do you act? That's
Yes.
the other thing. I remember years and years ago, I was on a subway in Manhattan. And this is like, one of those things of like judgments and labels.
Yeah.
So this woman gets on who's, I think she was like very pregnant. So, looked like she was about ready to give birth on the train kind of thing.
Yeah.
And train is packed. There are no seats. And usually I'll hop up, but I just pause to see if anybody else, like any, at the time, I mean, I was somewhat like, I wanted to see if any of the guys would stand up, I think. So I remember there was all these guys in three-piece suits, look like, very distinguished or whatever. Not one of them got up. And then there was this guy who was like, had 1,000 piercings and looked like he was like a biker type who I'm not labeling, but, looked a little gruffer. And he could not get up fast enough for this woman and said, "Oh, please sit down. You look like, I think it was actually in the summer too. So she was carrying all that baby weight, plus it was hot as blazes." And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, where I would have judged what he looked like and assumed that he was a particular type of person or a particular type of human being,
Right.
and how wrong I was. That here there were all these guys who I would assume were at that time, especially in the 80s or 90s, were very educated and everything, and not one stood up. And I remember thinking to myself, you got like, like I would have used profanity at the time,
Yeah.
but like really being disappointed. And it was such a like all of a sudden that was like probably one of the profound moments because I probably was in my early 20s and I was just starting my work career. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, like all of a sudden that whole idea of judging other people by their cover about how they looked
Right.
versus their actions and their words. And she was very thankful. I mean, she was so appreciative of that he had gotten up for her. It wasn't like she was like, "Thank you so much. I so appreciate. Yes, I really could use to sit down today." And had he not done that, I know I would have hopped up because I wouldn't have sat there and looked at her. But I was just curious to see whether anybody else was gonna like, hop up. But I remember really it changed the way I looked at people.
Yeah.
And so, can we go in and not, like you said, have 3 chapters of the book already written before that person ever even opens their mouth?
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, the way we do things as human beings is it's an empirical life. We have to have evidence for things to condition our behaviors so we survive. If we don't, in some ways start to make some judgments, we won't be here. Okay. And this is not anything other than how the species has gotten where it is. Notice all the people that are not here right now.
Mhm.
You can't.
Right.
So the point is we are here, and it's kind of like I use the squirrel analogy. Every time I drive down the road and I see a squirrel that's been hit by a car, it used to bother me a lot until I figured out that that's the elegance of how the world works. That DNA gene pool deserved to end right there in the middle of the street where it did. The ones who continue and persist do not have that behavior, which basically means that gives them a stronger gene pool that's going to persist and be around for a longer period of time. Hence, that's why we have a lot more squirrels than we used to. Okay. We have a lot more cars too, but so you're constantly challenging the edges of it. And so when you and I meet somebody, we have an automatic already listening where we have a history with what that looks like that was either placed there because of our experience or what we saw in the media or what we heard in stories from other people. And the whole challenge is always to take that, the wet fish that's slapping you in the face that you immediately think, wow, am I having that thought? Let's find out who this really is. I've been known to say things like, I don't want to piss you off or anything, but I'm really curious. Does it hurt to get all those piercings?
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that because I think what it does is like, yes, we are like, it is a survival mechanism to like, to sit there and say, okay, to some extent, and I don't want to say label, but see certain people and say, okay, this person does not look savory. And so my guard's gonna go up a little bit. And I spent a lot of, enough time in urban areas to know, like, kind of thing, like this guy does, or this person looks a little shady. I'm going to cross the street, or I'm going to wait and catch, and just pause or go into a store and then let this person pass.
Oh, yeah.
Versus, but on the other hand, is can I get into a conversation with someone and kind of shut off that part of my brain, which is making the judgments and is making the assumptions, and to some extent, and be open enough to be able to hear what the person's actually saying,
Yeah.
and allow them to share who they are, from for instead of me assuming who they are.
Yeah. Like it's an investigation instead of an interrogation, right?
Or it's an invitation,
Yep.
an invitation, like, I'm really interested. And that might be just getting on a meeting and someone shares something and you're like, oh, can we hop on a Zoom sometime, because I really want to get to know you. I love what you shared, and I'm curious, I want to learn more about you. And I like it, Matt, like invitation. I like this idea. I want to learn more about you.
Yeah.
Like that whole idea of discovery.
Well, I love it. And here we are again.
I know.
That like flew by, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. It did fly by.
So leaping off the cliff as we did in a linguistic kind of a dance, if you will. We can say that now. We've earned the right to say so. Of kind of combining our thoughts and experiences and just metaphors that we can come up with to give people some ideas of where you start to entertain empowerment, where you start to entertain, and that literally means being, filled with power in a situation where there is none. You don't go to the store and buy this by the pound. You have to generate it from nothing inside of you, the way you generate love, the way you generate laughter and joy and happiness. All these things come from inside of you. And the more you can have access to creating those instances where you now have that moment of joy that you got to by accessing repeated different questions about what do you love about your life, you know, to get to that point where you just had this most, it was a glamorous, beautiful smile on your face.
Thank you. Thank
Yes.
you. No, I love what we shared, because I think that if we can, if you can get people to that point, then I think then life doesn't become so harsh and hopeless, because
Yeah.
that's what I've been here. I'd heard over, I think quite a bit during the summer about people who really um, are hopeless. And that bothers me. My
Yes.
whole goal with what I do is to empower people And to empower people, my expertise, it's health and, and wellness. But eh, I think that if we come from a place of
Yes.
that joyful place, then we recognize that there's not much missing in our lives, that there's really not much we need. Like, we really have everything we need. When I was in my teacher training, I remember we had this guest teacher, and she walked around, or she said that day, and it's interesting, it was a long time ago. And it's interesting what you remember. And she said, yoga is the state of realizing that nothing is missing. And I remember still that kind of phrase. And I don't know, thinking to myself, oh my gosh, how do you ever get that? Like, how do you reach that state where you recognize that you're not missing anything, that your life isn't missing anything? And then we just got there.
Exactly. Exactly. And a thought to leave you and our listeners with is that there's a state called joylessness that's correctable. Even hopelessness, that's correctable too. But if you're in resignation, you've got some wrong beliefs and you need to start over from scratch and work at getting to those other two states and creating this access for yourself, because hopelessness comes from a recent set of experiences where you're now predicting it's not going to work out, and resignation is you're pretty damn sure it's not going to work out. So what's the bother and why try? Well, the reason is that you're among the chosen, you're among the blessed, you are here. Do something with it, damn it. Enjoy this life that you've got. Enjoy it. And if you're in resignation, this is who I'm talking to. If you're in hopelessness, help the people who are in resignation by asking them a simple question. What do you love about your life?
Love it.
Yeah. That's all I got for this week. How about you?
No, I think it's a great place to end, Bill.
All right. Well, bless all of you. And I hope that you are in touch with and experience just what a great blessing you are to the world and how blessed your life is. We are lighting the candle, a world that works. And by golly, it does work, doesn't it?
Yes, it
Bye
does.
for now, y'all.
Bye-bye, everybody.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch every episode as well as the rest of the network at exvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.